Alright, welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the US and around the world. This is a podcast you listen to with your fellow workers organizing on the shop floor. This is a podcast you listen to before walking into your union meeting. As always, I am Rico Rutia, here with my co-host Brian Pfeiffer. This week we bring you a special episode. Today we're going to focus mainly on two things. The first being the United Auto Workers strike, which kicked off last week. And the second is going to be the Worker and Community Summit that will take place in Neenah, Wisconsin on Saturday, September 30th. These two things will give us plenty to talk about today. So we're going to talk about the strike and we're going to talk about what the summit is all about. As always, though, we like to kick off our podcast with some jams. In particular, music that speaks to social justice, struggle, liberation, strikes, stuff like that. And tonight we're sharing a song called Fight, Smash, Win by the Street Sweeper Social Club, which is a band composed of Boots Riley, Tom Morello, and Trent Reznor. And I'd like to take a second to recommend the movie Sorry to Bother You, which was written and directed by Boots Riley. It's a movie that follows a young telemarketing worker around as he essentially sells his soul to climb the corporate ladder. There's elements of comedy and fantasy, but overall, it can be seen as a critique of capitalism, so check it out if you can. But for now, here is Fight, Smash, Win by the Street Sweeper Social Club.
Every nickel now, even if we don't fight, bodies hit the ground. I spit the sound of a million fists in a pound. I'm in the crowd till this whole thing switch round. My brain's on temporary disconnect. I shoot my mouth off, I can't find my pistol yet. You can call this music disrespect, cause it'll slap you in your face at your local discotheque. Mr. Green with your missiles and rockets. My paycheck burns a hole in your pocket. You told the judge put my name on the docket. Meeting in the break room, here's where we plotted. Let's fight, let's smash, let's win. We gon' fight, we gon' smash, let's win. Let's fight, let's smash, let's win. Just like getting up in the club with a fake ID. If it don't work, we gon' do it again. Your Honor, may it please the code. Swear me in on a book full of Tupac quotes. After what I see, you might noose my throat. Report the police, scribble down a few hot notes. Allow me to be the first to throw dirt on the graves. Excuse me, I never learned to behave. My great-great-granny was a Carolina slave. She whispers in my ear, saying sparkle blaze. Somewhere on the east side of steal and rob. A whole generation gotta make a job. And the light bill still ain't resolved. See the hungry mob pause and thrive. If you got a blacklist, I wanna be on it. If we gonna attack this, then we need to run it. If you see my hood, man, you might call it ghetto. Politicians are puppets, y'all, let's get you pedo. Let's fight, let's smash, let's win. We gon' fight, we gon' smash, let's win. Let's fight, let's smash, let's win. Just like getting up in the club with a fake ID. If it don't work, we gon' do it again. One day, but motherfucker, right now I breathe. And I may not be able to predict my demise. You can bet it will be on my knees. I'm rapping at the speed of the falling dollar. They got good to make you crawl and holler. Soul school like Easy and Paula. Hey, you gon' lead us, smoke trees and follow. Let's fight, let's smash, let's win. We gon' fight, we gon' smash, let's win. Let's fight, let's smash, let's win. Just like getting up in the club with a fake ID. If it don't work, we gon' do it again.
All right, welcome back, everyone. And of course, the big news this week is that the United Auto Workers Union is on strike. They went on strike at midnight Thursday night last week, so they're entering their third day, and they're striking against all three automakers. What I've learned from this is that they usually strike one automaker at a time. So for them to be striking all three automakers, that's different, and that's very encouraging. Also worth noting is that they're not striking at all the shops. So they've started with three key shops, three key plants, and it's basically up in the air as to what's going to happen, as we will see in a video that we will share in just a little bit. Just going through some of the news, I saw, photos from the strike, from the picket line, and a lot of the placards read record profits, record contracts, which I can't agree more with that. Also caught a video on YouTube of Shawn Fain speaking at the strike. We also caught a video on YouTube of Shawn Fain speaking at one of the strikes, one of the convergences, and talking about how this is class war, and hasn't seen class war like this in 40 years, which I think is either a reference to PATCO or a reference to stagnant wages since the late 70s. I don't know exactly what that is. In the news, I also saw that the big three are offering 21% wage increases over the course of multiple years. And, I can't stop to think of the audacity of these executives. Yeah. They demand bailouts from the government. They demand concessions from their workers, but they can't later on compensate for those concessions and meet UAW demands for living wages when they're making profits. What is that? What? So anyway, I went on the UAW website to see, what kind of information they have there, and just wanted to share some of the stuff from the website along with the video in just a little bit. But the UAW leadership, Shawn Fain, is calling this strike a stand-up strike. And I'm going to just dig into what they mean by that, because they have this question answered in their frequently asked questions section of the stand-up strike on the UAW website. So what is the stand-up strike? The stand-up strike is our generation's answer to the movement that built our union, the sit-down strikes of 1937. Then, as now, we face massive inequality across our society. Then, as now, our industry is rapidly changing and workers are being left behind. Then, as now, our labor movement is redefining itself. This is a strike that grows over time, giving our national negotiators maximum leverage and maximum flexibility to win a record contract. Next question is, how does a stand-up strike work? To which they respond, the stand-up strike is a new approach to striking. Instead of striking all plants all at once, select locals will be called on to, quote unquote, stand up and walk out on strike. As time goes on, more locals may be called on to, quote unquote, stand up and join the strike. This gives us maximum leverage and maximum flexibility in our fight to win a fair contract at each of the big three automakers. Locals that are not called on to join the stand-up strike will keep working. We will not extend the contracts, so you will be working without an agreement. And then they have a link letting people know exactly what that means. A couple of more questions that are worth sharing from the website on frequently asked questions about the stand-up strike. Why aren't we all striking every facility across the big three? That option is still on the table. The stand-up strike gives your national negotiators maximum flexibility. The stand-up strike gives our union the ability to escalate all the way to a national all-out work stoppage if necessary. It keeps the companies guessing and builds economic leverage against the big three over time if they refuse to negotiate a contract we deserve. So that's just some of the questions that they have listed as frequently asked questions about the stand-up strike on the UAW.org website. They also share a video of Shawn Fain answering the question, what is a stand-up strike? And I would like to share that here. So go ahead and check this out.
Everything working people have ever won, we've won together. Today, America's auto workers are in the fight of our lives. The fight for a decent standard of living. The fight for wages that grow with inflation. The fight to retire with dignity. The fight to protect our communities against plant closures. The fight for better work-life balance so we can see our children grow up and our parents grow old. Winning these demands will take all of us fighting together. It will take a return to our roots. Collective action gave birth to our great union. After years of facing down company thugs, spies, and anti-union laws that favored big business, the auto workers in Flint, Michigan took decisive action. In 1937, they occupied General Motors plants and set off an organizing firestorm in our country. After a few tense months, GM Auto Workers emerged victorious. They had won their union and a contract. The creativity, discipline, and defiant spirit of auto workers was contagious. The sit-down strike sparked a strike wave that quickly spread across the entire working class, everywhere from auto plants to department stores. Nearly 400,000 workers across the U.S. participated in sit-down strikes in 1937, giving birth to a new industrial labor movement. We are once again returning to our roots and reclaiming our tradition of holding the line for working people against unchecked corporate power. That is why we are launching a new kind of strike against Ford, GM, and Stellantis. This is our generation's answer to the sit-down strike of the 1930s. We're calling it the stand-up strike. This is a strike that starts small and builds over time as more and more of us stand up and join the fight. This is a strike that keeps the companies guessing as to where and when the next local will walk out. And just as importantly, we are striking the big three, all three. We told them September 14th is a deadline, and we meant it. The big three have made $250 billion over the last 10 years. They made $21 billion in profits in the first half of this year alone. We will not stand by as corporate executives and the rich continue to make extraordinary profits while the rest of us continue to get left further and further behind. And I want to be clear, our goal is not to strike. Our goal is to bargain a fair contract. But if we have to strike to win economic and social justice, then we will shut down the big three. We are not afraid to fight for what we deserve. We will stand up for ourselves. We will stand up for our families. We will stand up for our communities. So UAW family, be ready. If your local is called to stand up, I know you'll meet the moment, just like the generations that came before us did. While some of us are on the picket line, the rest of us will keep organizing our coworkers and our communities. Show management that you are prepared to join the stand-up strike. This is our generation's defining moment. Let's stand up for ourselves and the working class. Let's stand up for future generations. Let's stand up for economic and social justice. Let's stand up and once again make history together.
Now, when I watch videos like this, I usually make it a point to tune out the music that they're playing in the background because, the music makes you feel a certain something. It can make you feel sadness or fear, so I always make it a point to tune out the music that's in the background. And even with doing that and watching this video, I still love this video. It's refreshing. I haven't heard a labor leader speak like this since I've been involved in the labor movement, at least not at that level in the midst of leading a strike. Just talking about social justice, talking about the sit-down strikes, reviving the sit-down strikes, knowing that everybody is watching the United Auto Workers right now. So it's refreshing to hear Shawn Fain speak as to what's going on. So yeah, that's what's going on with the United Auto Workers. We're of course going to keep you updated as to where the strike is going, if anyone else has walked off or anything like that, but we will keep you updated every week. And up next, we have Brian. He's going to be talking about the Worker and Community Summit in Wisconsin, which We Rise Fighting is helping to organize. So Brian, handing the microphone over to you.
All right, Rick, thanks. Just a couple things on the UAW. Yesterday or Friday, there was thousands and thousands of workers in a rally. And in Detroit in particular, there's built up anger going way back, decades, of course, but especially since 2008. CNN reported yesterday that the big three auto companies received 62 billion. That's what it be. $62 billion during the bailout with the Troubled Asset Relief Fund in 2008. And then on top of that, they got money through the pandemic, some of the money through the pandemic federal bailouts as well. So beyond just the compensation of these company executives, some between 20 and $30 million, these companies have been just gorging on public money as well. So the anger in Detroit in particular is especially hot because the bankruptcy devastated public retiree pensions and the city in general, why these big auto fat cats got rich and destroyed communities and went home with and stole all kinds of surplus value from the workers. But Friday was a fantastic day in Detroit. Many of the videos, thanks, Rick, for raising that. It's really something to see. We'd encourage listeners to go check out the UAW International Facebook page. We've been covering a lot of struggles, and I'd say that besides the Teamsters, that UAW International social media has been quite something. And there's a whole variety of different videos, as Rick mentioned, and photos from all over the country. And in addition to the strike at these three locations, there's also the UAW is also on strike at Blue Cross Blue Shield, 1,000 workers in Detroit and also in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So it's quite hot, and this is, of course, going on at the same time as the writers and actors strikes. So things are moving, and of course, writers, actors, and auto workers are supporting one another on the lines in all kinds of other different ways. So right on, Rick. Thanks for your report. And this has a lot to do with our report on the Workers and Community Summit today, lessons and challenges from Wisconsin and history generally. We Rise Fighting, Labor Podcast right here, listeners. Our friends, we and our friends are sponsoring a Worker and Community Summit at the Neenah Labor Temple, 157 South Green Bay Road in Neenah, Wisconsin, Saturday, September 30th from 12 noon to 1 p.m. Will be a potluck, and then 1 to 3 we'll have a panel of worker and community members. More information is available at our Facebook page, where listeners can also find a meme and leaflet for the event for download or sharing on social media. And that's at We Rise Fighting Labor Podcast Facebook page. So some have asked us, why are we having this summit? Why the initiative now, and why is it being done? And I believe Rick and I agree that it's not a question of should we have this. It's absolute imperative that this kind of a summit happen. There's various different initiatives taking place across the country in the same vein, such as the Southern Workers Assembly in North Carolina and Virginia and other locations. And here in Wisconsin, where I'm located, this event that we're having for the Worker and Community Summit is a continuation of the People's Power Summit that was held in Maribel, Wisconsin in June of 2021, where we united workers, farmers, and community members with nutritious food, art, and other cultural elements. Were foundational in that event as well. And the same thing will happen at the Worker and Community Summit in a couple of weeks. And I think, Rick, you were inspired, and I was inspired as well, of course, by that summit. And I mean, by that People's Power Summit. And we came out of that with the idea for We Rise Fighting Labor Podcast. And it's been a wonderful ride since then, doing all the interviews and reporting on these labor struggles and working with you. And now we're going to go into, we're going to talk here a little bit about listeners, about some of the tactics that have not been effective in labor. And this relates directly to the Worker and Community Summit and why we're going to be talking and discussing at the summit on the 30th, September 30th in Neenah, some different tactics that could be employed and what is actually successful. And I'm happy we started out with the UAW because we're seeing that direct action gets the goods. There's been strikes and actions from Starbucks and workers all over the country the last couple of years. And this is in contrast to a lot of the typical tactics that have been happening, such as concessions to the rich or concessions to auto bosses, such as two-tier concessions or lobbying as a primary or legislative as a primary tactic of labor. And this, of course, is changing. And we know we're going to talk a little bit about this tonight, talk a little bit about the history on why some of that is the primary focus of the struggle. In our view here at We Rise Fighting has to be class struggle in the workshops, on the floor, connected to the community. And our strength and our power is at the point of production, at delivering services or making products. That's where we as the workers have our most power. And Of course, if we're in the public sector as workers, we have to work with legislative activity, but that's not the primary focus of struggle. Our power is building solidarity and unity with our fellow workers, as the UAW workers are doing right now, and others. So we're going to start off with this analysis with some statistics that we believe back up our analysis, and then we're going to get into a little discussion, Rick and I, which we're both looking forward to tonight, listeners. So we hope you stick with us and engage with our discussion tonight. So, Rick, you're going to start off with some statistics.
Yeah, I decided to dig into some information on Wisconsin. Decided to look at the union membership in Wisconsin, both the numbers and percentages. And this is real cut and dry, real simple. Let me just tell you the findings. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so everyone knows, so we're clear. So in case you want to look it up yourself, you can find it yourself and you'll find the same exact numbers. This is total union membership in Wisconsin. In 2012, Wisconsin had 293,000 union members, representing 11.2% of the workforce in Wisconsin. 10 years later, by 2022, Wisconsin was down to 187,000 union members, representing 7.1% of the workforce in Wisconsin. So let me rephrase that. In 2012, it was 11.2% of the workforce in Wisconsin. In 2022, 10 years later, it was 7.1%. Okay. In 2012, again, 293,000. By 2022, 187,000, meaning the state of Wisconsin lost more than 100,000 union members in the last 10 years. That's an average of 10,000 union members per year. Think about that. That's exactly why we're doing this summit. Think about that, because at the moment, I'm on social media and I follow unions and I see what they're communicating. And at this point, a lot of union members are already, a lot of union leaders, are already beating the drums for Biden in 2024, right? And that seems to be the only strategy, the only tactic that they have. But, and this is the big but, especially here in labor, the Biden administration helped crush the railway strike. I can't forget, I'm not going to let anyone in labor forget, the Biden administration helped crush the railway strike, the railway strike. And that's important because the US is seeing more and more strike activity, which is a huge reason, again, for the September 30th Worker Community Summit. The Worker and Community Summit will study and learn from all these recent labor struggles in Wisconsin and the broader US. Going back again to the Biden administration breaking the railway strike, I did get into that research as well. And I need to share this because we already know our union leaders are going to push Biden 2024. And these are the actual numbers. Again, I learned how to do this at the Labor Studies Center at the University of Massachusetts pro-union, pro-worker institution. And we're obviously a pro-union, pro-worker show, but these are the numbers, all right? And this is coming directly from congress.gov, okay? If you want to look it up for yourself, the bill number is HJ Res 100. And it was voted on November 30th, 2022 at 1:02 p.m. Okay, and the following passed: to provide for a resolution with respect to the unresolved disputes between certain railroads represented by the National Carriers Conference Committee of the National Railway Labor Conference and certain of their employees. Okay, again, this passed, and what this translates to is instead of allowing the railway workers to strike, they were forced into negotiations through this. Okay, so this crushed the strike. How did the vote break down? Check this out. 211 Democrats voted in favor of stopping the railway strike. In Colorado, where I live, I don't know their first names. It was Crow, DeGette, Negus, and Perlmutter. In Wisconsin, it was Kind and Moore, whoever they are. Also worth mentioning on that list is 5 members of the squad, 5 of the 6 members of the squad: AOC, Elon Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Jamal Bowman, Terry Bush, all voted to stop the railway strike. Only eight, single digit, 8 Democrats voted against it. 79 Republicans voted in favor of this legislation to stop the railway strike. And then 129 Republicans voted against it. Okay, that's in comparison to the 8 Democrats. Okay, in other words, 16 times the number of Republicans voted correctly for whatever reason, because I know Republicans will have their own twisted reason, but 16 times the number of Republicans voted correctly on this question. But the largest vote, the largest number by far, were Democrats looking to stop the strike. Okay, now let's go down some of these representatives because this is also worth looking at. Let's go ahead and start with you, Wisconsin. This Representative Kind received money from the Painters Union, got $1,000, and SEIU gave $5,000. Moore, Moore, received the following contributions: $5,000 from the Laborers Union, $5,000 from the Plumbers. The Postal Workers Union gave him $2,500, and the United Food and Commercial Workers gave them $2,500. Now, these may not seem like the biggest contributions in the grand scheme of things, but they are the largest contributions when compared to all other contributions from all other political action committees. These are the largest contributions they receive, is from unions. And then they go ahead and vote to crush the railway strike. In Colorado, Perlmutter, the Plumbers Union gave them $5,000. United Food and Commercial Workers, $2,500. The National Postal Handlers gave them $2,500. The New Jersey State Laborers Political Action Committee gave Perlmutter $2,500. Negus, AFSCME gave Negus $7,500. The Plumbers Union gave $5,000. SAIU $10,000. Laborers $7,500. UFCW $6,500. The Operating Engineers $2,500. DeGette got $5,000 from the UFCW, $10,000 from the Laborers Union, $10,000 from SEIU, $10,000 from the Plumbers, and so on and so forth. You know, and these are the largest contributions they receive, and they turn around and they crush the railway strike. And right now we're gearing up to elect more Democrats. We're gearing up to get Biden reelected. You know, so that's why this worker community summit is so important, because that's the only thing, that's the only tactic that we hear from our labor leaders, right? Vote for the Democrat for president every 4 years. Vote for the Democrat for Congress whenever those are elections are up, right? What's the other most popular tactic that our union leaders present to us? Buy American. These are the only tactics that our labor leaders are presenting us with right now. And at the same time, we're watching historic levels of activity of labor activity in the U.S. That's why we're having the Worker and Community Summit, to understand that, to understand the strikes that have taken place in Wisconsin, to understand the strikes that have taken place across the U.S. Because the U.S. has not seen labor activity like this probably since PATCO, since 1981, since the air traffic controller strike. So that's where we're taking the time to do this, you know. And one of the things that I've mentioned on previous shows about this is how it reminds me of the Teamsters strike in 1997 against UPS, the historic Teamsters strike of 1997, which got $15 an hour on their contract. I mean, this is 12 years before the Occupy movement. They had already secured $15 an hour. How did they make gains like that? Worker and community alliances, by making the workers and the community inseparable, by letting the community know that the workers' struggle is the community's struggle, that part-time America, as the Teamsters were saying in 1997, part-time America doesn't work. That resonates. That resonates with their membership. That resonates with the community. That's what this worker community summit is about. But waiting for institutionalized labor to get their stuff together and put an event like this together, I don't think that's going to happen. So that's why you're hearing it come out of a labor podcast. So that's some of the information that I found. Again, all these contributions, the AOC campaign, AOC got $10,000 from the machinists, $8,500 from the postal workers. The CWA gave her $2,500. AFSCME, $5,000. Unite Here, $5,000. Omar received $5,000 from SEIU, $3,500 from the Painters Union, $1,000 from the Postal Workers Union. Presley, Bowman, Bush, all of them received money from unions. And same deal. These may not seem like the biggest contribution amounts, but when compared to all other political action committees, they are the largest. You don't have to take my word for it. All of this information is available on the Federal Elections Commission website, and you just look for these political action committees. That's how unions give money. That's how politicians receive money. That's how candidates receive money. It's through political action committees. So if you're curious about the SEIU Political Action Committee, go in there and look up SEIU Political Action Committee, and you can navigate your way to finding this same information. These are the biggest contributions they've gotten, and they turn around and they shut down the railway strike. No, we need other ideas. We need to understand exactly what's been happening in U.S. labor as far as these strikes and all this labor activity in recent history. That is what the Worker and Community Summit is about.
That's it, Rick. So listeners, what we're putting before you today is exactly what Rick just said. The ideas, and program and the organizing that flows from that, correctly or incorrectly, has real consequences, life and death consequences. And we'll be talking about that. And unfortunately, some of the worst consequences of incorrect tactics and program are children suffer and die. And we'll be talking about that more. But just to take a quick step back, listeners might be wondering why these numbers plummeted so much in Wisconsin. And there's been a variety of debate about that. And many like to blame the right wing. There's a Bradley Foundation in Milwaukee that has schooled many of the politicians that passed these laws in Wisconsin, such as Act 10 in 2011. Wisconsin historically has been a strong union state, and up to 2011, before Act 10 was passed, public sector workers, the majority of public sector workers in Wisconsin had full collective bargaining rights, and that meant municipal workers, teaching assistants at the University of Wisconsin, custodians at the UW system. What Act 10 legislated in that statute that was passed and signed, the legislation that was turned into a statute, mandated that no collective bargaining rights anymore for public sector workers in Wisconsin. The only thing that could be negotiated was wage rates up to the rate of inflation. Pension contributions were not something that public sector workers had to pay because that was part of the agreements. Usually in collective bargaining contracts where wages were a little lower, but the workers got better pensions. Immediately upon signing of that act in June of 2011, workers had to start paying into their part for pension increases, which is a wage cut. And they had to pay for increased health care, and many other things were in the Act 10, as well as one of the worst provisions is that if there's a given unit in let's say a school district, that every year that unit, that union wants to certify, quote unquote certify, they have to get 50% plus one of the unit. And if somebody votes no or doesn't, or somebody doesn't vote, that counts as a no vote. So Wisconsin used to be a complete closed shop, whereby, for example, if you were a municipal worker or a public sector worker and you started working in the public sector, you had to join the union. And if you didn't join the union, you had to pay 90% of the standard dues rate to pay for the cost of operating the union. What Act 10 did, it essentially wiped that all out. Automatic dues deduction was also wiped out as well. So listeners, you can see how membership, because of these conditions, have plummeted. And then in 2015, right to work for less, which is a Jim Crow law, was passed. And then there were many other attacks on prevailing wage. So in the space of a few years, all of these anti-labor attacks took place. Now, of course, they were set up by the right wing and the rich and their political servants. But as Rick mentioned here, we're going to talk about some of the tactics that are effective and are not effective, both presently and historically, in our view. But we're opening this up for discussion, and that's also what part of the Worker and Community Summit is about. We know here we don't have all the answers. We need to talk to the community at democratic discussions on how labor and our community forces are going to move forward. So we are going to continue with the statistics Before we get to some of that, though. So there's a research organization in Wisconsin called the Center on Wisconsin Cows.org, COWS.org, and they have a report that was just published. And it's important to take a look at that report because we see that the standard of living in Wisconsin has plummeted for all sectors, but especially for people of color and for women that have lost, many things due to the austerity that has been pushed since 2011 and even before. And then in the United States, nationally, the U.S. Census Bureau states in a just released report that according to the New York Times, poverty levels have skyrocketed to the largest one-year jump on record. Let me read that again. Poverty levels have skyrocketed to the largest one-year jump on record. So while this is happening, inflation is stratospheric, all pandemic safety nets have stopped, student loan payments resume in October, and corporate and bank bailouts in the trillions continue unabated, and the U.S. continues to spend hundreds of billions on endless wars. So again, it's an imperative that we start having events like Southern Workers Assembly, worker and community summits in every community in the country to take up these issues, because we cannot live like this. We cannot have our children starving and child poverty rates go up and these types of horrific, macabre statistics, which are real. People suffer and die every day because of these policies. And if we look at some of the child poverty rates from December of 2021 to January 2022 alone, white children's poverty rate has went from 7.5 to 11%, Black children 19 to 25%, Latino 16 to 23%, and Asian 11 to 15.1%. And the number in poverty has just skyrocketed. A World Bank report released September 12th, 2023, estimates there are 333 million children globally, or 1 in 6 who live in extreme poverty. And that's extreme poverty, and there's billions more that live in poverty due to capitalist policies run by the World Bank and also pushed by the United States. And there's a report at that, the worldbank.org. And of course, we're using that statistic. We don't agree with the World Bank, but we're using their own statistics because if they're reporting it, it's usually accurate. So the Worker and Community Summit in Neenah then is an attempt to intervene in all of these abysmal conditions to build a better world. And we're not going to stand by and be silent and try to get permission from either, bureaucrats or politicians to have an event like the Worker and Community Summit that is direly needed to ameliorate the conditions that we're facing. And that the conditions of the children are just some of the worst conditions, but there's so many more. We know that housing is an absolute outrageous. Many cities are being gentrified. People cannot live, working multiple jobs, and there's so much more. So the goals for this summit, we are going to contribute an independent class-wide political and organizing approach, and this is going to be put up for discussion, that is rooted in the most oppressed Black and Brown leadership with lots of good food and positive cultural components, and that's essential. So these are all rooted in, we follow here, and it's important to know that Malcolm X, when he got out of prison, was an auto worker, and Fred Hampton Jr. as well. He worked in a union warehouse and his parents were union, and many Black leaders were actually union members themselves or come from union families. And Malcolm X once said, "History is best qualified to reward our research." So I'll stop there, Rick, just up until now to see if you have anything to add to this, and then we can go into a little bit about the public sector unionism history in the U.S. in the past quarter century to see what's been successful.
Nothing too profound to add. Just looking back on that struggle in Wisconsin and thinking about how workers in Wisconsin, were getting pizza orders from workers in Egypt at the time, because the workers in Egypt were calling in pizza orders for the workers in Wisconsin in an act of international solidarity. Because they had their own thing going, in Africa, the quote unquote Arab Spring that was taking place at the time. And I think that sort of thing is important. I think that lesson is important here too, because the Arab Spring, that sort of thing took off because one nation saw another nation rebel, and they were like, you know what, that's inspiring me to do the same. And same thing happens in the labor struggle. Same thing happens with strikes. When a strike is successful, that's going to embolden other workers. So that's why we're doing this summit, is because we want more successful strikes, and we already have some recent lessons to draw from. So that's what the Worker and Community Summit is about. And honestly, I was just kicking back and brewing on that. I don't want those lessons to be gone. I don't want those lessons to be forgotten.
That's right, Rex. Thanks for raising that. And our listeners, if you're unfamiliar with some of the struggle that in response to Act 10 that we mentioned, and there was a mass state capitol occupation of this. There's a great member leader from the American Federation of Teachers, Local 212, a videographer named Sue Ruggles. You can check out on YouTube the great videos she put up of the state capitol occupation that happened for days and weeks in Madison to oppose Act 10. And workers came from all over the world, as Rick mentioned, and there was many different acts of solidarity. But one of the things we're going to raise here is discussions on that was a complete political and economic attack to overturn the progressive era and many things that were won in Wisconsin. So, although the state capitol occupation was extremely critical and probably one of the greatest activities workers in this country have done, and community forces and students since probably the 1947 strike wave or 34 general strikes in San Francisco and Toledo and Minneapolis, and the strike in North Carolina at the textile workers in 34, that's where the struggle stayed at the state capitol. So some discussions that have been held over the years and some things that were taken up later on by the Chicago Teachers Union or West Virginia teachers is that in situations like that, just relying on parliamentary methods or legal methods or even an occupation, when it's that kind of a scale of an attack, overturning decades of legislation and history that's going to have huge consequences, that other things like direct action strikes, shutting down highways like they do in Latin America, in progressive struggles in Peru, et cetera, that's happening now, or France that we've discussed on the show, or walkouts and other kinds of direct actions are absolutely necessary. And many of the legislators are business owners. They own properties, they own businesses. And one of the things that we know, of course, as the rich auto bosses are learning now, is that the one thing they understand is profits. And when their profits are put at peril, they pay attention. And so the public sector is a little different in terms of the way things are done financially, but the class struggle question is the same. Getting and moving at the point of production or the point of services is our strength. So we wanted to talk a little bit, listeners, about public sector unionism history in the U.S. in the past 75 years. And just real quick, a couple highlights. One of the important notes is that during the McCarthy period in the early 50s by Joseph McCarthy, speaking of Wisconsin, an enemy of the people, who was working with the John Birch Society and others, right-wing organization. Part of the civil rights movement revival happened in 1955, actually, after the murder of Emmett Till, Mrs. Rosa Parks, SNCC, Paul Robeson, et cetera. That really took us out of the McCarthy period into a new era of activism. And that was also during the Kohler strike that happened in 1954 in Wisconsin, and many other things were taking place, such as 1959. Wisconsin was the first state to win collective bargaining rights for public sector workers in that year. That was just after 1954. That strike happened in the McCarthy period. And also, we must remember that the Rosenbergs were executed during the McCarthy period as well. So all of these things were taking place. And we're saying this all for a reason, and we'll have a discussion about this, Rick and I, later, about what really wins. And the reason we're raising this primarily is because we can't just create unions out of thin air, or public sector unions out of thin air. What we did win, and the laws on the books that we did win, were part and parcel of a movement, part and parcel of a class struggle that was involved in so many different things, like the civil rights movement, the human rights movement, and from the late 50s until the 70s, all of these struggles, it wasn't just a specific union struggle, a narrow union struggle. Most of the public, if not all, in some capacity or aspect of a public sector, in particular union struggles, were part of the anti-Vietnam War movement, the farm workers movement, the Brown Berets, the Black Panthers, the women's and gay liberation movement, student fights that won a variety of concessions, from open admissions, the Black and Brown studies, often at great sacrifice, such as 80 of 82 Black students being expelled at the University of Oshkosh in 1968. And a huge one was the 1970 postal workers strike, which defied both union bureaucrats and the federal government. Nixon stood down to the postal workers, and that was mostly Black and brown and militant white workers in New York City who led that and won historic gains for the postal workers. Prior to this strike, postal workers actually lived in poverty and had hardly any of the things that they have today. And that wildcat strike that was not sanctioned by the labor bureaucracy or anything like that, that the workers had enough, they were fed up, and they went out. Then the National Guard was brought in, and even the National Guard said, this is insane. These workers work very hard, and we can't do this type of work. So that was a huge win there in 1970, the postal workers winning a contract. And also a very important aspect of all this is public sector teachers and other public sector workers, but especially teachers. Waves of wildcat strikes from one end of the country to the other in the 60s and 70s. So their contracts and their wins and their gains, such as pensions and class sizes and the things that they could bargain over, of course, did not just drop from the sky. Many people, such as we talked to Betty and Racine, Rick and I, when we were there in 1978, the Racine, Wisconsin teachers went out on a strike and were framed up, jailed, strip searched in Racine, actually, and taken off to jail and carted in chains to jail and buses. And this is the type of activity that was going down in the 60s and 70s. Mass militant struggle in connection with all of these other struggles that were taking place. So another lesson is that 1973 we won Roe versus Wade, but it wasn't the illustrious progressive character of the Supreme Court justices in 73 that said, hey, we're going to give reproductive justice to women. There was tens of millions of women and their allies in the streets that were demanding that in all kinds of different ways. And that struggle for women's reproductive justice was part and parcel of many women organizing unions in their workplaces, especially over issues like economic issues, but also against sexual harassment and many other activities. So this is what we're raising all of this because these will be some of the discussions that we'll have at the Worker and Community Summit. What kind of approach are we going to take? Are we going to take a UAW approach, or are we just going to beg politicians for our liberation and lobby? Well, unfortunately, we've seen this is not just esoteric. We're not talking pie in the sky. We are giving Wisconsin here as a case study today, both for the positive aspects of the struggle, but also for when incorrect tactics take place where we can end up. And it's not pretty, but we can come out of it, and we have faith and hope in our class, in workers, and the community to move forward in a better direction that we need to be moving in, like the UAW and the writers and actors strike. All right, so some of the examples that we're going to be talking about there at the summit are the Southern Workers Assembly, and actually the Durham workers, sanitation workers, were just on strike for 6 days. Now in North Carolina, collective bargaining is illegal, but there many cities have passed floors for municipal workers, such as $20 an hour from United Electrical Workers 150, agitating and organizing and going to packing city council meetings and going to the legislature and packing the legislature and engaged in protest and leafleting at 5 a.m. when the workers come to work. And all of that has resulted in major concessions and major advances, such as civil workers' bills of rights, such as floors for wages. And this is in North Carolina, a state that collective bargaining is illegal, and advances are still being made. And what we're seeing too is the nurses, National Nurses United in Texas, Florida, North Carolina, other locations, other states in the South that are very hostile to labor are making advances and organizing shops, such as in Austin, Texas. The nurses are organizing many hospitals there, and in Florida, and just organized one in Asheville, North Carolina. And all of this is organized in an approach that's rooted in the workers at the point of production and or delivering services in alliance with community allies. Many of these unions, of course, take some parliamentary or legislative channels, but they also understand that those are just one aspect, one tactic of the struggle, but not the primary aspect, not the primary arena of struggle. The primary arena of struggle is the workers in action, striking, direct action, getting active in the shop, and doing what's necessary to march on the boss, to take our lives and our workplaces into our own hands. We're the ones, the workers, who care about our patients and our children. And we are the ones not only looking for better conditions for ourselves, but of course we work to make sure it's a better world for the children and for our patients and those that we serve in the community, especially public sector workers, but all workers. So Rick, we're talking here about you raise many things, and we're talking about that we're in a period now where we're seeing the bosses move real quick when the workers go on strike at multiple plants all over the country in the hundreds of thousands. We saw that with the academic workers strike in California. We've been reporting on all these. And this is why there's even a discussion today about putting to bed the two-tier system, the macabre two-tier system, or COLA, getting back COLA at the big three. The only reason this is being discussed is because the workers took their lives into their own hands and hit the bricks and are saying, hell no, we can't live like this anymore. And as you mentioned, Brother Fain, the president of the UAW, talks about in depth in the video you raised. All right, Rick, so I'll stop there before we go into a little more and just wrap up with some of the details for the summit on the 30th.
Yeah, no, they're talking about shorter working hours. They're talking about 40 hours pay for 30 hours work. And I think that's a step in the right direction. To tease this out even further, man, I think we shouldn't be working 20 hours. We shouldn't be working 40 hours, 30 hours, 20. We're doing that because of corporate profits. That's what's steering this. But as far as the workers producing what we ourselves need to survive and function in this society, we don't need 48 hours a week for that. So I'm glad they're putting, the shortened hour work week on the map again. I appreciate that. And also, Brian, you were talking about, some of the lessons that we've learned on this podcast, and I'm going to refer people to episode 15 of our podcast with Black Workers for Justice. We did an interview with them, and they raised many valuable lessons. They gave us a lot of valuable lessons. And I think one of my biggest ones with them is how they redefine what a union is altogether, or revisit what a union is altogether. They sometimes work with the definition that I wholeheartedly embrace, that a union is nothing more than a group of workers. And to me, that's really empowering. To me, that sparks the imagination. A union is nothing more than a group of workers, right? Everything else, like the bureaucracy, its politics, it could be a revolutionary union. It could be a reactionary union. It could be a liberal union. It could be a striking union, a militant union. Everything else is adjectives. But a union is nothing more than a group of workers. And I think that gives us something to think about, something to strategize with. So I'm going to refer people to that episode, and also our episode on the 1997 UPS strike, the 1997 Teamster strike against UPS, because we do tease out a lot of the lessons from that struggle in that episode. And also we have one final episode that I'm going to refer people to because of the Worker and Community Summit. And that episode is called The Arsenal of Labor. And in that episode, we talk about all the different types of strikes and tactics, work floor, direct action kind of stuff that workers can do to advance the labor struggle in the workshop, in the community, stuff like that. And yeah, we talk about all of that. Especially in the UPS Teamster strike, we talk about how labor and the community were united because they had to be, and that's part of what made that struggle so successful. That struggle also taught us that if you're going to negotiate a contract, you better start talking about that stuff 2 years before the contract expiration date. Open it up to the membership, have democratic circles, where people discuss, where people debate, where people tease out ideas of what they're going to say. In other words, create spaces where people can discuss and organize. So yeah, lots of lessons on this podcast already, from the stuff that we've reported on, the stuff that we've analyzed, the people that we've interviewed. There's a lot of lessons in there already, but we are really looking forward to teasing out all these lessons from recent labor activity in the US at the Worker and Community Summit on September 30th. So please keep in touch, keep listening to the podcast until September 30th. Keep watching the Facebook. We will have more information, but we are presenting this because we want to present new ideas out there or refresh old ideas that still work. Strikes still work. Direct action still works. So we're putting these ideas back on the table because the U.S. labor movement is putting them back on the table. We haven't seen this much labor activity, again, in about 40 years. So we're trying to make sense of it. We're trying to take best practices. We are trying to unite unions and worker struggles with community struggles. We're trying to take lessons from this UAW struggle, from graduate workers' struggles, from Starbucks workers, from coffee shop workers. We're trying to take all of their lessons and hash them out and go back to our unions, go back to our community groups, our churches, our synagogues, whatever your place of worship may be, and get people active in a fight back against these corporations. So that's what it's all about. Please keep listening. We will offer more details as the date approaches. Thank you all, everyone, always for listening. Solidarity and love to all. Have a good night.